The photograph sits in front of me right now. Edges yellowed, corners soft from being held too many times by trembling fingers. A 17-year-old girl with feathered bangs and a smile that could convince you the world was still worth believing in. Her eyes, though, if you look close enough at those eyes, you'll see something hiding behind that smile. Something that knew what was coming before anyone else did. Her name was Rhonda Marie Fisher, and in the fall of 1987, she vanished from the small town of Cedar Mill, Oregon, leaving behind nothing but questions, accusations, and a secret so devastating that an entire community chose to bury it rather than face what they had allowed to happen. I know this because I'm the one who finally dug it up. My name is Daniel Reeves, and Rhonda Marie Fisher was my mother's best friend. For 37 years, my mother carried guilt like a second skeleton inside her body. She never spoke Rhonda's name out loud. Not once. Not until she was dying of pancreatic cancer in a hospital bed, her body failing but her conscience finally demanding to be heard. What she told me in those final hours changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about truth, about the monstrous things good people convince themselves to ignore. But before I tell you what she said, before I take you into the darkness of what happened to Rhonda Marie Fisher, I need you to understand something. This story isn't just about one missing girl in a forgotten decade. This is about every time you've looked the other way, every whisper you've heard and chosen not to repeat, every gut feeling you've buried because confronting it would cost you something. If you're watching this right now, I need you to stay with me. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about small-town America, about justice, about the people we trust with our children. This story took me 4 years to piece together, and I nearly lost everything pursuing it. But Rhonda deserved to have her story told, and the people who destroyed her needed to finally answer for what they did. So if this resonates with you, if you believe that silenced voices deserve to be heard, share this with someone right now. Subscribe to this channel because what comes next isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. The Cedar Mill of 1987 was exactly what you'd picture when someone says small Oregon town. Population hovering around 4,000. One main street with a hardware store, a diner called Patty's, a single-screen movie theater that had been showing the same films for months after their big city release dates. Everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed unlocked. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and parents trusted that their neighbors were watching out for them. That trust would prove to be the most dangerous thing in Cedar Mill. Rhonda Marie Fisher was born on March 15, 1970, the only child of Harold and Diane Fisher. Harold worked at the lumber mill that gave the town its name. Diane cleaned houses for the wealthier families on the east side of town, the ones with big Victorian homes and secrets that matched. They weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. Every month was a calculation, a constant algebra of which bills could wait and which couldn't. But Rhonda was their joy, their everything, their proof that struggle could produce something beautiful. She was brilliant in the way that scared her teachers, the kind of intelligence that asked inconvenient questions and refused to accept easy answers. By the time she was 15, she had read every book in the Cedar Mill library and had started requesting titles through interlibrary loan that raised eyebrows. Philosophy, psychology, true crime. She wanted to be a lawyer. She used to tell my mother, Eleanor, that she was going to leave Cedar Mill, go to a big university, and spend her life putting bad people behind bars. She said it with such certainty, such fire, that Eleanor believed her completely. Rhonda was the kind of person who made you believe impossible things were simply inevitable. They met in 7th grade. Rhonda and Eleanor bonded over their shared position as outsiders. Eleanor was the new girl, having moved from California after her parents' divorce. Rhonda was the smart one who made other kids uncomfortable with her vocabulary and her refusal to pretend she didn't know the answers. Together, they formed a friendship that Eleanor would later describe as the purest thing she'd ever known. They did everything together. Studied at Rhonda's kitchen table while Diane served them lemonade and cookies. Snuck cigarettes behind the baseball diamond and coughed until their eyes watered. Talked about boys and futures and all the places they'd go once they escaped the suffocating smallness of Cedar Mill. But somewhere in their junior year, something changed. Eleanor noticed it first in the small things. Rhonda started wearing long sleeves, even in warm weather. Her laughter, once so easy and bright, became forced and rare. She stopped talking about the future. When Eleanor asked what was wrong, Rhonda would change the subject with a skill that was almost frightening in its smoothness. Then came the day that would haunt Eleanor for the rest of her life. It was September 3rd, 1987, a Thursday. Eleanor remembered the day of the week because they had a chemistry test that neither of them had studied for. Rhonda found Eleanor at her locker before first period, and she looked different. Resolved. There was a strange calm in her eyes that didn't match the purple shadows beneath them. She handed Eleanor a sealed envelope. On the front, in Rhonda's careful handwriting, it said, "Open this if something happens to me." Eleanor laughed nervously. "What are you talking about? What's going to happen to you?" Rhonda didn't smile. "Just promise me. Promise you'll open it." Eleanor promised. She shoved the envelope into her backpack and forgot about it, caught up in the ordinary chaos of being 17. She didn't know that she would never see her best friend again. She didn't know that envelope would stay sealed for 37 years, buried in a shoebox at the back of her closet, a weight she carried through marriage, motherhood, and eventually, her own death. Rhonda Marie Fisher attended school that day. She took the chemistry test. She ate lunch alone in the library, which wasn't unusual. She was seen getting into a car after the final bell. And then she was gone. The first 24 hours after Rhonda's disappearance were filled with the kind of frantic energy that would later curdle into something much darker. Diane Fisher called Eleanor's house at 7:30 that evening, her voice tight, with the particular worry that mothers know in their bones. She asked if Rhonda was there, if maybe she'd forgotten to call home, if the girls were studying together and had lost track of time. Eleanor said no. She hadn't seen Rhonda since school let out. She felt a cold finger trace down her spine as she hung up the phone, but she pushed the feeling away. Rhonda was smart. Rhonda could take care of herself. By 9 o'clock, Harold Fisher was driving the streets of Cedar Mill, his truck crawling through neighborhoods as he scanned for any sign of his daughter. By 11, he had called the police. By midnight, the nightmare had officially begun. Chief Donald Brewer took the report himself. He was a large man with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered wood, all angles and deep lines. He had been chief for 19 years, and in that time, Cedar Mill had seen its share of teenage runaways. Kids got restless. Kids got romantic ideas about hitchhiking to California. Kids, especially the smart and stubborn ones like Rhonda Fisher, sometimes just needed to spread their wings. He assured Harold and Diane that their daughter would probably walk through the door by morning, embarrassed and apologetic. These things happened. He'd seen it 100 times. But morning came, and Rhonda didn't. The search began officially at dawn on September 5th. Volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot, clutching thermoses of coffee and trying not to look at the Fishers' hollow faces. They split into groups and fanned out across the town, calling Rhonda's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked the woods behind the baseball diamond where kids sometimes went to drink and be alone. They checked the abandoned railroad station on the edge of town. They checked the quarry, a thought that made Diane Fisher collapse against her husband's chest, unable to breathe. Nothing. No trace. No Rhonda. Eleanor walked those search lines with her mother, her legs moving mechanically while her mind replayed every conversation, every moment, every sign she might have missed. The envelope in her backpack pressed against her awareness like a splinter, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Opening it would mean acknowledging that something had really happened. Opening it would make the nightmare real. On the third day, Chief Brewer held a press conference. The reporters from Portland had arrived by then, drawn by the scent of tragedy. Brewer stood behind a podium and spoke in measured tones about the ongoing investigation, about leads being pursued, about the community coming together in this difficult time. Then he said something that would set the town's narrative for the next 3 decades. "We're looking at all possibilities," he said, including the likelihood that Rhonda left voluntarily. Evidence suggests she may have been planning to run away. The Fishers, watching from the crowd, looked like they'd been physically struck. Diane's mouth opened and closed, soundless. Harold's hands curled into fists at his sides. "What evidence?" a reporter asked. Chief Brewer looked directly at the camera. Rhonda Fisher had been seen getting into a vehicle of her own free will. She had told classmates she wanted to leave Cedar Mill. She had a history of, he paused, choosing his words carefully, emotional difficulties. It was a lie. All of it. But Eleanor, 17 and terrified, and carrying a sealed envelope she was too afraid to open, didn't know that yet. She would learn the truth eventually, but by then, it would be far too late to save her friend. The investigation, such as it was, went cold within weeks. Chief Brewer released a statement saying that all evidence pointed to voluntary disappearance. The Portland reporters went home. The search parties disbanded. Life in Cedar Mill slowly, grotesquely, returned to normal. Harold Fisher, who had worked at the mill for 22 years, started showing up to his shifts drunk. He was fired by November. Diane stopped cleaning houses, stopped leaving her own house, stopped doing much of anything except staring out the window at the empty street. The town's sympathy, brief and shallow as a puddle, evaporated in the face of their persistent grief. Why won't they just accept it? Eleanor overheard her own mother say one evening. The girl clearly ran off with some boy. Happens all the time. The Fishers need to stop making everyone uncomfortable. Eleanor felt something die inside her that night. Some small, essential faith in the adults around her simply stopped breathing. She went to her room and sat on her bed, staring at the envelope with her name on it. Her fingers touched the seal. She could feel something inside, papers maybe, the weight of secrets pressing against the thin barrier. But she didn't open it. She told herself it was because Rhonda would come back. She told herself it was because opening it felt like giving up. But the truth she wouldn't admit until she was dying decades later, was simpler and uglier than that. She was afraid of what she might find. She was afraid it might require her to do something. The weeks turned to months. Christmas came and went, a hollow performance in the Fisher household. Eleanor's mother forbade her from visiting, said the Fishers' grief was unhealthy, said Eleanor needed to move on with her life. Move on. As if her best friend hadn't dissolved into thin air. As if the questions didn't keep her awake at night. As if that envelope wasn't screaming at her from inside her closet. By spring, Harold Fisher was dead. The official cause was a car accident, his truck wrapping around a tree on a back road at 3 in the morning. But everyone knew the truth. Everyone knew about the empty whiskey bottles, the way he'd started talking to himself in public, the time he'd shown up at Chief Brewer's house at midnight, screaming accusations that the whole town had to pretend they hadn't heard. Diane lasted another year before the cancer took her. Some said she willed herself to die, that she simply stopped fighting. She was buried next to her husband in Cedar Mill Cemetery, under a headstone that made no mention of their missing daughter. And just like that, Rhonda Marie Fisher had no one left to remember her. No one except Eleanor, who still hadn't opened that envelope. Now I need to ask you something. Something that might be uncomfortable. Have you ever known something was wrong and chosen not to act? Have you ever held the key to someone's truth and been too afraid to turn it? Tell me in the comments. Be honest. Because this story is about to get harder, and I need to know you understand the weight of what silence can cost. I was born in 1990, 3 years after Rhonda disappeared. I grew up in Seattle, where my mother had fled after graduating high school, putting as much distance between herself and Cedar Mill as she could manage. She never talked about Oregon. She never talked about her childhood at all. What I knew of my mother was this. She was kind but distant, loving but haunted. There were nights I would find her sitting in the kitchen in the dark, staring at nothing. When I asked what was wrong, she would smile that smile that didn't reach her eyes and tell me everything was fine. She was just thinking. I learned not to ask. She married my father, Thomas Reeves, when she was 23. He was a good man, steady and uncomplicated, exactly the kind of person my mother seemed to need. They built a life together. She became a librarian. He worked in insurance. They raised me in a house with a good school district and a tree in the backyard and absolutely no photographs from before 1988. I noticed the gap eventually. Every family has albums, collections of frozen moments that trace the story of where they came from. But my mother's story seemed to begin abruptly in her early 20s, as if she had sprung into existence fully formed. When I asked about her childhood, She gave vague answers about a small town and not much to tell. It wasn't until I was 35, sitting in that hospital room with the machines beeping their steady countdown, that my mother finally decided to tell me the truth. She was thin by then, cancer having stolen the softness from her face. Her eyes, though, were clearer than they'd been in weeks. She had stopped the morphine that morning, wanted to be present for what she had to say. The pain must have been excruciating, but she never showed it. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you about Rhonda." The name meant nothing to me then. I leaned closer, took her hand, waited, and she told me everything. She told me about Cedar Mill and the friendship that had defined her youth. She told me about the girl with the brilliant mind and the sad eyes. She told me about the envelope she had never opened. She told me where to find it. "In my closet," she said. "Shoebox. Blue one. I've been carrying it for 37 years. I was too much of a coward to open it. Maybe you'll be braver." "Mom," I started, but she shook her head. "Listen to me. Something happened to Rhonda. Something bad." She was trying to tell me, and I was too scared to listen. I've spent my whole life running from that, and now I'm dying and she's still out there somewhere, waiting for someone to tell her story. Her hand tightened on mine with surprising strength. "Find out what happened to her. Please. I need to know that someone finally cared enough to look." She died 3 days later, slipping away in the middle of the night while I slept in the chair beside her bed. I woke to silence where the machines had been beeping, and I knew immediately that she was gone. The envelope was exactly where she said it would be. I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of my mother's things, and held it in my hands for a long time. It was sealed with clear tape that had yellowed with age. My mother's teenage name was written on the front in faded ink. I thought about what it must have been like for her. 17 years old, terrified, holding this same envelope while her best friend was being erased by a town that didn't want to know the truth. I thought about the weight she had carried, the guilt that had shaped her entire adult life. Then I opened it. Inside were 3 items. The first was a photograph of Rhonda and a man I didn't recognize. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with silver hair and a smile that didn't match his eyes. They were standing in front of a house I would later identify as one of the Victorian mansions on Cedar Mill's east side. The second was a key. Old, brass, the kind that unlocked something important. The third was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten, dated September 2nd, 1987. The day before Rhonda disappeared. My hands shook as I read. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person, but I was afraid. I'm still afraid. But someone has to know the truth. His name is Warren Caldwell. He's been hurting me for 2 years. It started when I was 15, when my mother started cleaning his house. He was so kind at first. He said I was special. He said I was mature for my age. He said all the things that made me feel like I finally mattered. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I tried to tell someone once. I told Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor. She looked at me like I was speaking another language. Then she called Mr. Caldwell's office. He's on the school board. Did you know that? He donated the money for the new gymnasium. The next day, Chief Brewer pulled me out of class. He told me that making false accusations against respected community members was a serious offense. He told me I could ruin my family's reputation. He told me to think very carefully about what I claimed to remember. So I stopped talking about it. I stopped talking about a lot of things. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Caldwell told me yesterday that he's arranged for me to leave Cedar Mill. He says it's a special opportunity, a private school in another state. But Eleanor, I've heard him on the phone. I've seen the way he looks at me when he thinks I'm not paying attention. I don't think I'm going to a school. I think I'm going somewhere much worse. If something happens to me, I need you to take this letter and this photograph to someone outside of Cedar Mill. Not the police here. Brewer is in Caldwell's pocket. Maybe the FBI or a newspaper in Portland. Someone who doesn't know Warren Caldwell anything. The key is to his study. The bottom drawer of his desk has a false bottom. You'll find evidence there. Enough to destroy him. Please, Eleanor. You're the only person I trust. Don't let him get away with this. Your friend forever. Rhonda. I read the letter 3 times. Then I sat in the silence of my mother's empty house and wept for a girl I had never met, for the friend my mother had failed, for the decades of silence that had allowed a monster to walk free. Warren Caldwell. I had a name now. I had a place to start. The next morning, I began my research. I told myself I would just look, just gather information, just try to understand what my mother had been carrying all those years. I didn't realize I was about to dedicate the next 4 years of my life to this case. Warren Caldwell, I discovered, had been one of Cedar Mill's most prominent citizens. His family had founded the lumber mill that gave the town its name. By 1987, he was running the family business, serving on the school board, and donating generously to local causes. He was married to Patricia Caldwell, a quiet woman who sat on the boards of various charities and never seemed to speak in public. They had no children. I found his obituary from 2015. He had died of a stroke at age 73, survived by his wife, and remembered as a pillar of the community, a philanthropist, a man who had dedicated his life to making Cedar Mill a better place. The obituary mentioned nothing about accusations or investigations or missing girls. He had died in his bed, surrounded by comfort, having never answered for what he had done. For a moment, I nearly gave up. What was the point of pursuing a dead man? Justice, traditional justice, was impossible now. Caldwell was beyond the reach of any courtroom. But then I remembered Rhonda's letter. The bottom drawer of his desk has a false bottom. You'll find evidence there. The Caldwell mansion still stood. That much I had confirmed through property records. Patricia Caldwell had passed in 2019, and the house had been purchased by a developer who planned to convert it into a bed and breakfast. The renovation had been delayed by various bureaucratic obstacles. The house sat empty. I still had the key. It took me 6 months to build the courage to drive to Cedar Mill. I told myself I was being thorough, doing my research, preparing properly. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of what I might find. When I finally made the drive, it was a gray October morning, the kind of day that seems designed for confronting ghosts. Cedar Mill looked almost exactly like I had imagined it, preserved in amber, a small town that time had largely forgotten. The main street was there, the hardware store, the diner that was now called something other than Patty's but occupied the same space. The Caldwell mansion stood at the end of a tree-lined street on the east side of town. It was massive, Victorian Gothic, the kind of house that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. The developer's signs were posted on the lawn, but the windows were dark and the grounds were overgrown. I sat in my rental car and stared at it for a long time. Then I got out and walked to the back door. The key fit perfectly. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old money and something else, something I couldn't identify, but that made my skin crawl. The furniture was still there, shrouded in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. The electricity had been turned off, so I navigated by flashlight, following the layout I had memorized from old real estate listings. Caldwell's study was on the second floor, a large room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive oak desk that dominated the space. I stood in the doorway and imagined Rhonda here, 15 years old, being groomed by a predator who had convinced everyone he was a saint. The desk had 3 drawers on each side. The bottom right drawer was locked, but the brass key opened it. Inside, I found what appeared to be ordinary files. Business documents, tax records, correspondence with mill suppliers. But Rhonda had said false bottom. I removed everything from the drawer and examined the interior. The bottom seemed solid, but when I pressed on the back edge, I felt it give slightly. I worked my fingers around the perimeter until I found a small notch, barely visible in the flashlight beam. The false bottom lifted out. Beneath it was a leather portfolio, soft with age but well-preserved. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Polaroids, mostly, the kind that were popular in the 80s. Girls in various states of undress, their eyes dead, their poses unnatural. Some of them looked barely into their teens. I recognized Rhonda from the one she had included with her letter to Eleanor. She appeared in several of these photographs, her face a mask of dissociation that I now understood was a survival mechanism. But she wasn't alone. There were other girls, many other girls. There was also a notebook, handwritten entries dating back to 1972. Names, dates, locations. It was a record, a meticulous accounting of Warren Caldwell's crimes spanning more than 40 years. He had been systematic about it, almost businesslike. He recorded how he selected his victims, how he groomed them, how he ensured their silence. And there, near the end of the entries, was Rhonda Marie Fisher. The entry was dated September 4th, 1987, the day after she disappeared. Subject RF has become problematic. Her attempt to report to Patterson showed poor judgment and necessitated intervention through Brewer. However, the risk of future disclosure remains unacceptable. Contact has been made with associates who will facilitate permanent relocation. RF will be transported to processing facility in Nevada on September 4th. Permanent relocation. Processing facility. The clinical language couldn't disguise what it meant. Warren Caldwell hadn't just been a local predator. He had been part of something larger. A network. And Rhonda hadn't just disappeared. She had been trafficked. I sat on the floor of that dead man's study and tried to process what I was holding. This wasn't just about one missing girl in a small Oregon town. This was about a systematic operation that had destroyed who knew how many lives. And Warren Caldwell had died peacefully, respected, mourned by a community that had no idea what monster they had been harboring. But Caldwell was dead, and I still didn't know what had happened to Rhonda. The notebook led me down a rabbit hole that consumed the next 2 years of my life. I quit my job, burned through my savings, and alienated most of my friends with my obsession. My wife, Sarah, tried to be understanding at first, but even her patience had limits. "You're not going to bring her back," she said one night, after I had spent another weekend chasing leads instead of being present for our life together. "This girl has been gone for almost 40 years. Even if you find out what happened, what difference does it make now?" "She doesn't have anyone else," I said. "Her parents are dead. Her friend, my mother, is dead. Everyone who should have cared is gone. There's just me." Sarah shook her head. "But you're destroying yourself. You're destroying us." She wasn't wrong. I could feel myself becoming someone I didn't recognize, consumed by a mission that might have no end. But every time I thought about stopping, I remembered that letter. I remembered a 17-year-old girl begging her friend for help that never came. Someone had to care enough to look. The network Caldwell had referenced turned out to be larger and more sophisticated than I could have imagined. It spanned multiple states and had connections to people in positions of power. Politicians, law enforcement, businessmen. They had created a web of protection that made traditional investigation nearly impossible. But the world had changed since 1987. Records that had been sealed were now accessible. Witnesses who had been silenced were now elderly and less afraid. And the internet had created communities of survivors who had spent decades trying to be heard. I found one of those survivors in a small town in Arizona. Her name was Margaret Shunn, and she had been 16 when Warren Caldwell had selected her in 1979. Unlike Rhonda, she had managed to escape before being transported. She had spent the next 4 decades trying to expose what had happened to her, only to be met with disbelief, denial, and threats. When I showed her the photographs and the notebook, she broke down completely. "He kept records," she said through her tears. "Of course he did. That narcissistic monster. He probably thought he was untouchable." "He was," I said. "He died in his bed." Margaret's eyes hardened. "But you found the evidence. After all this time, you found it." "I'm trying to find out what happened to Rhonda Fisher," I said. "Do you have any idea where they took the girls who were," I struggled for the right word, "transported?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "There was a facility," she said finally, "in Nevada, near the Utah border. I heard whispers about it from the other girls. They called it the farm. Once you went there, you didn't come back." The farm. The name sent ice through my veins. I spent the next 6 months trying to locate this facility. Official records showed nothing. Land surveys, property transfers, business filings. It was as if the place had never existed. Then I found a former FBI agent named Robert Harrison who had spent the last years of his career investigating trafficking networks in the western states. He was 78 now, living in a retirement community in Phoenix, but his mind was still sharp. When I mentioned the farm, his face went pale. "How do you know about that?" he asked. I told him about Rhonda, about Caldwell, about the notebook. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "We knew about it," he finally said. "In the late 80s, we got close. We had informants. We had surveillance. We were building a case that would have brought down the whole network." And then he paused. "One night in 1991, the whole place burned to the ground. By the time we got there was nothing left. No evidence, no survivors, nothing." "Survivors?" Harrison looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "There were girls there, Reeves. Girls who had been taken just like your Rhonda. When that fire started, they were locked in their rooms. 47 girls died that night, and the official investigation concluded it was an electrical fault." I felt sick. "Rhonda," I managed. "Do you know if she was one of them?" Harrison shook his head. "The bodies were too badly burned for identification. We had a list of girls we believed had been taken to the facility, but we could never confirm who was there when it burned." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn folder. "I kept this," he said. "Unofficial copy. Against regulations. But I couldn't let it go." Inside was a list of names. Girls who had been reported missing between 1975 and 1991, all from areas where the network had been active. I scanned the pages until I found what I was looking for. Rhonda Marie Fisher, 17, Cedar Mill, Oregon. Last seen September 4th, 1987. She was on the list. I stared at her name and felt the weight of decades pressing down on me. If the fire had happened in 1991, Rhonda would have been 21. She would have been held at that facility for 4 years. And then she would have died, trapped and abandoned, while a building burned around her. After everything I had learned, this was how her story ended. Not with rescue, not with justice, but with ash and silence. I thanked Harrison for his help and drove back to my motel in a daze. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall and tried to accept that this was the end. Rhonda was dead. She had been dead for over 30 years. There was no happy ending here, no redemption, no rescue. I had failed her, just like everyone else. I didn't leave the motel room for 3 days. I ate vending machine food and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do next. The evidence I had gathered could still be valuable. It could expose what Caldwell had done, shed light on the network, maybe bring some measure of justice to the other survivors. But it wouldn't bring Rhonda back. On the 4th day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, a 775 area code. "Nevada. Mr. Reeves?" The voice was female, elderly but strong. "My name is Margaret Chen. We spoke a few months ago." I sat up. "Yes, I remember. Is everything okay?" There was a pause. "Something has happened. I need you to come to Reno." I was on a flight that evening. Margaret met me at the airport, looking more animated than she had during our first meeting. There was something different in her eyes. Hope, maybe. Or disbelief. "After you left," she said as we drove, "I couldn't stop thinking about that facility. The farm. For 40 years, I told myself everyone who went there was dead. It was easier that way. But I started reaching out to people. Other survivors, people I'd lost touch with. We have our own network now, you know. Social media groups, encrypted chats. We've been finding each other again." She pulled into the parking lot of a coffee shop and turned to face me. "Yesterday, I got a message from a woman in Colorado. She had seen my post about looking for information on the farm. She said she had been there. She said she had survived the fire." I felt my heart stop. How is that possible? The FBI said there were no survivors. Margaret's face was grim. The FBI said a lot of things that weren't true. That's why we stopped trusting them. She handed me her phone. On the screen was a message thread with someone identified only by initials. "RM, I saw your post. I need to be careful. There are still people who want us silent." "MC, I understand. Can you tell me anything about yourself?" "RM, I was there from 1987 to 1991. I escaped during the fire. I've been hiding ever since." "MC, your initials." "RM, what's your full name?" "RM, I haven't used my real name in over 30 years. But since you're asking, Rhonda Marie Fisher." The phone nearly slipped from my hands. It could be anyone, I managed. Someone who read about the case, who's pretending. Margaret nodded. That's what I thought too. So I asked her to prove it. I asked her something only someone from Cedar Mill would know. She scrolled down in the conversation. "MC, if you're really Rhonda Fisher, Tell me something that wasn't in any public record. Something only you would know. RM, when I was 17, I gave my best friend an envelope. I told her to open it if something happened to me. Inside was a photograph, a key, and a letter explaining everything. Her name was Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor Brooks. My mother's maiden name. How would she know that? I whispered. The envelope was never public. My mother never told anyone. I don't know, Margaret said, but I think you need to meet her. 3 days later, I was standing in the parking lot of a diner in rural Colorado, waiting for a ghost to appear. Margaret had set up the meeting, served as intermediary, convinced the woman calling herself Rhonda that I could be trusted. I saw her before she saw me. She was walking across the lot from a pickup truck, moving with the caution of someone who had spent decades looking over her shoulder. Her hair was gray now, cut short and practical. Her face was weathered by time and something harder than time. But her eyes. When she got close enough for me to see her eyes, I knew. They were the same eyes from that photograph. The same eyes that had stared out from a 17-year-old face, holding secrets and fear and stubborn, defiant life. Rhonda Marie Fisher was alive. She stopped a few feet away from me, studying my face. You look like her, she said finally. Like Eleanor. Around the eyes. She was my mother. Rhonda's expression shifted, a complex movement of grief and something like relief. Eleanor, she said softly. She finally opened the envelope. It took her 37 years, I said. She was dying. She asked me to find you. Is she? Rhonda didn't finish the question, but I understood. She passed away 2 years ago. But she never forgot you. She never forgave herself for not opening it sooner. Rhonda was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, a single sharp movement. We have a lot to talk about, she said. Let's go inside. Over the next several hours, Rhonda told me her story. The complete story, the version no one had ever heard. She spoke in a steady voice, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this narrative in her own mind for decades, waiting for an audience. The night of September 4th, 1987, Warren Caldwell's men had been waiting for her after school. They had drugged her, put her in the back of a van, and driven for hours. She had woken up in a windowless room with a metal cot and a bucket in the corner. The farm was exactly as bad as the rumors suggested. Girls were held there for months or years, broken down through abuse and starvation, then sold to the highest bidder. Some were shipped overseas. Some stayed in the country, passed between wealthy buyers like commodities. Rhonda had been there for 4 years. For years of horror that she described in careful, clinical terms, as if she were reporting on someone else's life. She told me about the things that were done to her, the way she had learned to survive, the moments when she had been certain she would die. But she hadn't died. On the night the fire started, a guard had gotten careless. Rhonda had found a window that wasn't properly secured. She had climbed out while flames consumed the building behind her, had run into the Nevada desert in the middle of the night, and had somehow survived. For weeks, she had wandered, afraid to approach anyone, certain the network would find her if she revealed herself. She had stolen food, slept in abandoned buildings, and slowly made her way east. Eventually, she had ended up in a small town in Colorado where a kind, elderly couple had taken her in, no questions asked. She had created a new identity, built a new life, and spent over 30 years hiding in plain sight. Why didn't you come forward? I asked. After Caldwell died, after the years passed. You could have told your story. Rhonda looked at me with ancient eyes. And say what? That I was held captive by a trafficking ring for 4 years? That a respected businessman in my hometown was the one who sold me? Who would have believed me? You had evidence. The envelope you left for my mother. An envelope that was never opened, she said flatly. An envelope that sat in a closet for 37 years while I was being destroyed. Eleanor was my best friend. My only friend. And she couldn't even. She stopped, her voice breaking for the first time. I'm sorry, I said. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But she was sorry too. She was so sorry. Rhonda wiped her eyes. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that you found the evidence. You found Caldwell's records. That's more than anyone else has ever done. I want to make this public, I said. I want to expose everything. The network, the cover-up, Chief Brewer's involvement. I want people to know what happened to you and all those other girls. Rhonda was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. And for just a second, I saw the girl she had been, the brilliant, stubborn girl who wanted to be a lawyer and put bad people behind bars. I've been waiting 37 years for someone to say that, she said. Let's burn it all down. Over the next 18 months, we worked together to build a case that would be undeniable. Rhonda's testimony, combined with Caldwell's records and the corroboration from other survivors like Margaret Shun, painted a picture of systematic abuse and institutional failure that shocked even the most cynical observers. We bypassed traditional law enforcement entirely. The network's corruption ran too deep, too old. Instead, we worked with investigative journalists, advocacy organizations, and a new generation of prosecutors who specialized in cold cases and human trafficking. The story broke in the spring of last year. A major investigation spanning 4 states. Warren Caldwell's legacy was finally exposed for what it truly was. 3 other members of the network who were still alive faced prosecution. Chief Donald Brewer, who had died in 2008, was posthumously revealed to have taken bribes from Caldwell for decades. The town of Cedar Mill had to reckon with its own complicity. The school board that had protected Caldwell, the community that had chosen to believe Rhonda was a runaway, the families who had benefited from the mill owner's generosity while ignoring the whispers about his true nature. It wasn't justice exactly. Too many of the guilty were already dead. Too many of the victims had lived their entire lives in shadow. But it was acknowledgement. It was truth. And for Rhonda Marie Fisher, after 37 years of silence, it was finally the chance to reclaim her own story. The memorial service was held on a Saturday in October, exactly 37 years and 1 month after Rhonda Fisher had walked out of Cedar Mill High School and vanished. It took place in the Cedar Mill Community Center, a building that had been partially funded by Warren Caldwell's donations and now bore a new name after the town had voted to strip his legacy from every public space. I stood in the back and watched as people filed in. Some were survivors, women who had responded to the public story and wanted to stand in solidarity with someone who had finally spoken their shared truth. Some were journalists, still documenting the ongoing revelations. Some were townspeople, grappling with the horror of what their community had harbored for so long. But the most important people in that room were at the front. Rhonda Marie Fisher, now using her real name for the first time in decades, sat between Margaret Shun and a younger woman named Sarah Holloway, who had been one of the investigators on the case. They were surrounded by representatives from victim advocacy groups who had worked to bring this day about. I had asked Rhonda what she wanted from this service. Closure? Recognition? Revenge? She had thought about it for a long time before answering. I want them to know my name, she said. For 37 years, I was nobody. I was a runaway, a problem that solved itself, a girl who wanted too much and got what she deserved. I want to stand in front of that town and make them see me, make them say my name. And they did. One by one, people approached the microphone. Former classmates who remembered Rhonda but had believed the official story. Teachers who had failed to see the signs. Relatives of other victims who had never been found. Each of them spoke her name, Rhonda Marie Fisher. When it was finally Rhonda's turn to speak, the room fell completely silent. She walked to the podium with the same quiet dignity I had seen in her since the day we met in that Colorado diner. She looked out at the crowd, and for a moment, she was 17 again, standing in a small town that was about to swallow her whole. Then she began. In September of 1987, I trusted the wrong people to protect me. I trusted a guidance counselor who called my abuser instead of helping me. I trusted a police chief who told me to stay silent. I trusted a town that wanted the money and the prestige more than they wanted to see the monster hiding behind them. She paused, her voice steady. But I also trusted the right person. I trusted my best friend, Eleanor Brooks. I gave her evidence that could have destroyed Warren Caldwell, and she was too afraid to use it. The room was absolutely still. For a long time, I hated her for that. In my darkest moments, I blamed her as much as I blamed anyone. She had the power to save me, and she chose not to. Rhonda looked directly at me. But then her son found me. He picked up the burden she couldn't carry. He spent 4 years of his life pursuing a truth that everyone else had abandoned. He didn't know me. He owed me nothing. but he believed that a silenced voice deserved to be heard. She smiled, and there were tears on her face now. Eleanor made a mistake. A terrible, human mistake. But she raised a son who spent his life trying to make it right. And because of him, I'm standing here today, speaking my name, telling my story, finally free. The room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. I was thinking about my mother, about the weight she had carried for so long. I was thinking about the envelope that had sat in her closet, waiting. I was thinking about her dying words. Find out what happened to her. I had. And somehow, improbably, wonderfully, the ending was better than anyone could have hoped. After the service, Rhonda and I stood together in the parking lot. The autumn sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Cedar Mill's main street stretched out before us, the same street where a 17-year-old girl had last been seen 37 years ago. What happens now? I asked. Rhonda was quiet for a moment, considering. I'm going to testify in the remaining prosecutions, she said. Then I'm going to work with Margaret and the other survivors to support people who are still coming forward. There are so many stories that haven't been told yet. She turned to look at me. And you? I've been thinking about that, I said. This story, Rhonda's story, it matters. But there are others. Other cases that went cold. Other communities that chose to look away. I'm thinking about investigating them. Giving voice to the people who were silenced. Rhonda nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud. I hope so. We stood in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streetlights of Cedar Mill flickered on, casting pools of light into the gathering darkness. Thank you, Rhonda said finally, for not giving up, for believing me when you didn't even know me. I looked at her, this woman who had survived the unsurvivable, who had emerged from darkness into light after nearly 4 decades in hiding. Someone had to care enough to look, I said. I'm just glad it finally made a difference. Rhonda Marie Fisher smiled, and for the first time since I had met her, the smile reached all the way to her eyes. It made all the difference in the world. 6 months later, I published the full account of my investigation. The book became a catalyst for change, inspiring other cold case investigators and leading to the reopening of dozens of similar cases across the country. 3 more trafficking networks were exposed. Hundreds of survivors finally received acknowledgement of what had been done to them. But the greatest change was more personal. Rhonda reconnected with the family she had been forced to leave behind. She found cousins she had never known, relatives who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the girl who had vanished and never came back. She also found Eleanor's grave. I took her there on a spring morning, to the cemetery in Seattle where my mother was buried. Rhonda stood before the headstone for a long time, speaking words I couldn't hear. When she came back, her eyes were clear. I forgave her, she said simply. It took 37 years, but I finally forgave her. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some wounds never fully heal. But sometimes, if we're lucky, if we refuse to give up, we find our way back to something that resembles peace. Rhonda Marie Fisher was 17 when she was stolen from her life. She was 54 when she finally got to tell her own story. And now, at 58, she stands as proof that silence can be broken, that truth can outlast the liars, and that it's never too late for justice. This is her story. This is my mother's redemption. And this is my promise that I will keep searching for the voices that have been silenced, the names that have been forgotten, the girls who disappeared and were told they didn't matter. They matter. They always mattered. And now, finally, the world knows.